Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network here at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership again at coalitionradionetwork.com, with our legacy shows spanning, well, going on 8 years of continual broadcasting from the most basic internet radio on up through AM, and now, of course, our digital platform at coalitionradio.us. Well, I met our very special guest tonight, if you will, digitally, while researching, I think, an issue that strikes profoundly at virtually every aspect of public life, and it's something we'll discuss tonight. It's called Defend the Guard. A stunning op-ed in the Idaho Statesman came up in my digital research. And it struck me, first off, after reading it and doing the typical background work Googling, that somehow I'd run into digitally possibly the most liberty-focused executive officer of any state here in the United States. The clarity of the article was amazing. There was distinct historical references. There was a constitutional discussion about an issue that I think affects probably every community in her state, in the great state of Idaho. And that is, of course, the National Guard and its role as a tool in our foreign policy. I'd like to welcome for the first time to the Coalition Talk Radio, Janice McGeachin. She is the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Idaho. Lieutenant Governor, thank you so much for joining us on, I can only imagine, what must be one of the most hectic months of your life.
Well, it's great to join you this afternoon, Pat. I've enjoyed getting to know a little more about your organization, and I'm honored to be invited to be on your program this afternoon.
Well, what's unique, and I'll admit we're kind of fanboys over here already, because you represent really, I think, the ideal in American government. You are a citizen legislator. You have served multiple terms in the Idaho State House, managed to survive that emotionally, I guess, because state houses being what they are. We refer to our state house here in Rhode Island as Halitosis Hall because of what goes on. We are not a bastion of liberty here in Rhode Island. While at the same time, you are an active participant in what we refer here to as the dreaded private sector. You not only live in your community, you've got emotional and financial investments in the form of businesses throughout your community. So you create wealth, you hire people, you impact local communities, at the same time diving in to leverage your expertise in helping run them. That was really the ideal of our founding fathers, wasn't it?
Absolutely. That's what our nation is based on, the opportunity for the individual to have the freedom and the liberty to operate their enterprises and provide for their own family and themselves. That's how this great nation was created by our founding fathers, and that's what has helped to make the United States so successful of a country that it is.
Right.
We do have some concerns. It's as the government continues to grow and expand, especially what we're seeing in some of the modern day politics today, where I have a concern and a fear that is more and more is at risk for those who don't share that sentiment of that role of government. And as you referenced, there's too many people that view the business owner as being the bad guy, and we're the ones that are creating the jobs and providing revenues into the coffers of all levels of government. We're certainly not the bad guy.
Mm-hmm. I can remember as a very young person leaving church and my father pointing out to me a number of folks in the community who own businesses. And he he referenced them with the respect accorded to folks who had leveraged, as I always say, their success, employed folks, created wealth, both not only for their family but for the community at large. And so growing up, those folks occupied a role of respect. Nowadays, folks who own businesses, particularly small, I quote unquote, small to medium sized businesses, which are, patronized all the time by government as the engine that drives the American economy, while simultaneously sucking the very life out of them and making them the water boy for just about every social initiative. So yes. It's great to see someone like yourself involved in this type of role. Let me ask you a question we often ask first timers here. Hopefully we'll get together every now and then you achieve what we call repeat offender status here in the coalition. But what was that moment in your life when all of a sudden you understood, whether as a young person, maybe someone who was involved in a business, the notion that self-ownership, liberty, self-autonomy, self-direction was a critical part of your life? When was it that you fully started to understand how important liberty played a role?
Well, my liberty moment was the day that I was born. I was raised into a more traditional conservative family, with the traditional roles. My mother stayed at home, cared for 5 of us, and raised us. We went to church every Sunday, and these ideals never did leave me. They helped create who I am even today. But as I grew up and went to college and got married, my husband and I became partners in life, partners in business. And of course, it's that experience in business that as a small business owner, I know that the best role for government is for the government to get out of my way. Mm-hmm. And I love the quote that's Henry David Thoreau, that government is best which governs the least. And I subscribe, one of my favorite founding fathers is Thomas Jefferson. And the principles that he supports and promoted are really all about the idea of less government interference in the lives of the individual and the family and the business.
How did first of all, let me define the Defend Guard movement as I've seen it, as I'm new to it and I'm doing my initial research. What you, as a state executive and a handful of states around the nation are actively doing is to create, if you will, within the federal government, the requirement that simply the federal government, before taking our young men and women out of their homes, out of their lives, out of their workplaces, out of their careers, and before they take them off to foreign adventures in foreign lands and get involved in police actions in these nebulous type of quasi-wars, before they do that, they have to fulfill their constitutional responsibility and actually declare a war and bring the case to the Congress so that the proper branch of government will submit its approval. How did you first get involved with this movement?
Well, it kind of probably goes back over a period of several years. I can remember after I was first elected as Idaho's lieutenant governor 3 years back, I went to a conference back in Washington, D.C., and we toured the memorial, the cemetery there. And there was a whole section of the cemetery there that is dedicated to men and women who have died from the conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's one of the busiest section of the garden of the lands there, and it's sad because with this war going on for 19 years now, it is the longest war that the United States has been entangled in. And so, I just got to know, I started meeting more individuals, veterans that had been serving in Afghanistan or Iraq, and listening to their stories, so many sad stories of how the war has impacted their lives, whether they were hurt, killed, or came home and been affected by PTSD, which is a very real concern. We actually operate 4 businesses here in Idaho, and excuse me. Sorry, we had a little interruption there. Just kind of threw me off for a second. Jordan, can you lock that door there? We operate 4 businesses here in Idaho, and we have a couple of veterans that we employ now, and one of them is really struggling. I'm really concerned about his well-being right now. You know, he's been having to go through some counseling. Even now, years later, it's affecting his life, so that in the daily course of operations, in whatever they find to do, it really affects their lives even today. And it's really hard. People don't understand some of these long-term impacts that our veterans are experiencing. And so as you get to know more and more of these veterans and the way that they've served our country and the way that they get disregarded and really not in many cases, except for, you know, under President Trump, he has brought greater attention and clarity to the need to better support our veterans and our troops, and working to free up the Veterans Administration so that our veterans can receive much better service than what they have previously. We can't just send these people off and not giving them a clear mission and then bring them back home and expect everything in their life to be beautiful and clear. It's so just getting to know a lot of these people more on a one-on-one basis. I started learning about their effort to bring the troops home. We tried a year ago through our state GOP. There was a resolution that passed through our central committee to go back to Congress, urging them to do what our Constitution says in Section 8 of the Constitution, which says Congress shall have the power to declare war, and only Congress has that power. And because Congress has been abdicating their responsibility for this long, they still have not clearly, you know, we went over there originally with a mission, but the mission complete, we never left. We stayed there, and the troops were kept both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And just hearing some of the horrifying stories of our troops and how the situations that they're being placed in, and the lack of direction, lack of support from Congress, it's enough. Enough is enough. It's time to end it, bring our troops home. And the resolution that passed through our state committee was taken to the legislature, and unfortunately the state legislature did not sign on to this resolution. So the effort continued, and the movement then changed from going to petitioning Congress to do their job to an effort where we all, as states, we recognize that we are sovereign states, and according to the 10th Amendment of our Constitution, where each state is a sovereign state and has the ability to act on their own. And that's when the effort moved to this bill that would have gone through the state and directed each of our National Guards in the respective states by claiming the authority that we have in our Constitution, the Guard could not be deployed unless there was a declaration from Congress. So that's where that effort shifted within the last year, and it grew. Momentum started growing across the nation. I think there were about 23. Right before our interview, I attempted to get an update on the status of the bills across the state. Unfortunately, we all got sidetracked terribly by the coronavirus, the plague, and But I think there were something like 23 states across the nation that had representatives who had brought the same legislation to their legislature. So we had an effort in Idaho. It did pass through as a resolution because there wasn't time really to support the bill as it was originally drafted. But I think, keep coming back next year, and sometimes it takes time, several years, to get these important things passed through.
Yeah, let's look for a moment, if you will, at the history of the National Guard. It's interestingly enough, the concept of a National Guard goes all the way back to the 17th century, and it's really it's such an apt analogy for what happens in government and big government in general, because in the first 200 or so years of the National Guard's existence at some level or another, it started, I think, in the original Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was a very practical implementation of local defense. It was an extension, if you will, of home rule. You had National Guards being put together by different states, and they were to react to disasters or internal strife, including, but not limited to, obviously, the Civil War. Everything, like so many areas of government in the 20th century, started to go awry, where all of a sudden you government, as it will often do, will look at assets, and I use that term euphemistically, and sense that, hey, there's opportunity here. There's tools to be used. And so in the past 20 to 30 years, as a matter of fact, legislation has accelerated to the point where there essentially has been a hijacking of the National Guard by the federal government. And what started at, again, so innocuously as a sharing of expenses, then ultimately the takeover of a number of the expenses, and then ultimately the drift that occurred as the federal government, and I'm talking about some specific laws, in the NDAA, if you're a Liberty person, it is one of the most tangled abuses of legislative power in this nation's history, because it can literally mean everything to anybody. It's sort of this gigantic soup, this stew of government excesses. So in the post 9/11 era, everything's on the table. So in 07 and 08, they continued to expand federal power into it. In 2012, they added the National Guard to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is a clear abrogation of what the concept of the Guard was, wasn't it? How did this happen, and how does this always happen?
Yeah. Well, good question. Perhaps funding and money can be a big part of that. The more money that gets pumped in, then a lot of special interests become entangled in that appropriation, and they tend to want to, continue and further whatever their role that they want is to fulfill. Let's see, what was I gonna say? We did have a sit-down conversation with our General Garshak here in Idaho, because you can't be putting big things like this through without going and sitting down and talking to him. And he did express concern about this effort, that it might put some of those federal dollars at risk. He said, if you were to ask me today, would I support this? He said, no, I wouldn't, but he did welcome the discussion and the debate. He says it's something that we should be talking about. These various guards around the country are put in place to defend and protect the states. And again, going back to the role of Congress and their lack of ability to truly declare a war and provide properly for those service members, because they're not doing their job, they have to rely on these guards to pull them out, to go away from defending their respective states, to send them into these other parts across the world. And it just compounds things.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the original constitutional justification of this, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. It's to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrection, and repel invasion. That's it. In fact, in your op-ed, speak to, if you will, General Washington, then President Washington's objection. I mean, you mentioned 4 or 5 of the principal architects of this nation, and they've all addressed this issue at some point or another. I mean, Jefferson, Hamilton. Tell us a little bit about that historical background.
Yeah, well, President George Washington was unambiguous, as written in the editorial. And his words, "It is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world." President Jefferson was equally explicit: "Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none." President Monroe is the one who formalized the policy, the Monroe Doctrine, which said that the U.S. would not interfere in the internal affairs or worlds of other nations. And then, of course, Benjamin Franklin, his wise counsel, there never was a good war or a bad peace. So our founding fathers have set the precedents of what the true, clear intent of our nation's foreign policy should be. And that is, first and foremost, to protect our soil and our citizens from foreign attack. And beyond that, if there is any effort to go after and be entangled in any foreign country, it should be, this is the role of Congress to declare that, have a clear mission. You go, you have your mission accomplished, and then you come back home and you work to continue to protect the borders of the United States and the citizens of this country.
And what's amazing too, if you go back to the great Colin Powell, the Powell Doctrine as a successor to the Vietnam War, or I should say the Vietnam Police Action, clearly stated that as a government there should be a goal, an objective, and most importantly, an exit strategy. And to your point, we have yet to see that at any level. What's interesting about this too, on a political level, so many of the proponents of this style of legislation and this, if you will, attempt to retrench American governmental powers are folks who are quote unquote right of center. I have to point out editorial that we are often accused of being the quote unquote the war hawks. Yet the reality is that you represent a new generation of politics where you're cognizant of the cost of war, both financial and moral, and let's just say on a personal level, and understand how terrible it truly is. You don't just give lip service to it. You're looking as an executive of the state of Idaho to protect your Idaho National Guard from that which we are often accused of precipitating. There's an irony that I find stunning. I'm old enough to remember, the anti-war movement, and there are times like this where I'd like to know where it's gone. But that's me editorializing. What is the Idaho National Guard? And again, I'm learning about this, and that's why I'm so grateful. If you're just joining us, Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin of the great state of Idaho is joining us. She has been a significant force, if you will, in moving, if you will, the movement to protect the Guard, hashtag protect the Guard, going forward, to take the National Guard away from being a tool of our foreign policy. Is the Idaho National Guard a significant presence, and have there been significant deployments, if you will?
Absolutely. Here in Idaho, our Guard, we have one of the best prepared guards in the country in terms of both training and equipment. We're very fortunate in that regard to have the asset that we have in our National Guard. But it's also because of that the Idaho Guard gets sent to these areas, maybe perhaps more so than some other states. Mm-hmm. So, we're blessed because we have some of the best trained men and women, and we do have some of the best equipment, but they're being pulled away from our state and mm-hmm. becoming entangled in other areas. And that does leave our state in precarious situation that if something were to
Right.
happen within our state, that our men and women who are there to protect our state and the borders within our state will be somewhere else. And that's a real concern. That has a lot to do with this whole movement, the language to subscribe these men and women of our National Guard and keep them within our state boundaries. And they can't leave unless the Congress does their job.
Right. And
declares a war and sends them.
And it's why historically we have federal constitutional and federal law put in place, for example, posse comitatus, which in its pure form should be restricting the deployment of federal troops into the states, as well as now, of course, what was supposed to be an historical barrier to prevent the deployment of state troops. The 10th Amendment Center, by the way, is a wonderful organization. We're actually privileged here in Rhode Island to have one of our few Liberty representatives who actually be an attorney who spent time working at the 10th Amendment Center. I'm starting to see a resurgence, if you will, in the use of the 10th Amendment. I believe it's for a long time it's been the forgotten movement. We're all, of course, intimately aware of the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. We're reacquainting ourselves with the Fourth Amendment, despite some of the best efforts of big government. But how important do you believe the 10th Amendment is in redefining this out-of-control relationship between government and the people?
It's critical, and it is what makes our nation so unique against all other nations in the world, is that we are a united group of states, and it is so unique in how our form of government is set up. And if you believe in the separation of the states and their independent sovereignty, and what we as a nation, the founding fathers did, they worked really hard to protect that careful balance. And when they went to their first convention, that was what they were all fighting about. There was one group that wanted to have a strong central government and provide, certain role to the states. And then there was the other group of people that were really afraid of this big central government, and for good reason, because that's what we escaped from when we came over to this land. And so the Constitution, the result, and the ensuing Bill of Rights was all meant to protect that carefully constructed form of government, that the federal government, the central government, was meant to be a very small, defined, very limited role, and that all other areas of government, whether it's healthcare or how to educate your students, it should all be left. The states were meant to be the laboratory of the laboratory of innovation. That's what I was trying to say. That each state would, determine what's best for their people living within their boundaries. And
Right.
And it's perfect, because if you want to live in California or New York, where you have these, more of a big role of government and have them help dictate every aspect of your life, then you can choose to live there. If you want to live in a great state like Idaho, where we're more independent and we want government out of our lives, nobody's going to interfere in our right to keep and bear arms and our right to practice our religion how we see fit, then you can live in a state like Idaho. And that's the way it should be. We should not be having any government try to dictate to all of us across the country how we should live every little detail of our lives. So our Constitution was set up to protect that, and the Bill of Rights carefully crafted to keep that in place. Now it's our responsibility to start acting more like sovereign states that we are, unfortunately, the policymakers like to dangle the carrot of the federal dollar in our face, and so we want that money, so we grab that money, and then we have to agree to comply with all these conditions of that money. So as states, we need to start acting more like sovereign states, and sometimes say, no thanks, we're not going to take that. We don't want that program because we don't want this government, this big central government, to control every aspect of our lives.
People forget that unless a power is explicitly given to the federal government, all other powers still reside at the state level.
That's right.
And it's such a straightforward concept. Do you feel, and I'm not going to put you on the spot with Idaho in general, but do you feel that in many places in this country, it's simply either an absence of, or a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps never having been taught about your civil liberties and your rights and what we used to call civics? Is the absence of that creating a situation where folks don't know how to defend rights that they don't even know they have?
I do believe that that's a big part of it. And I think that that's why education is so important, that we teach our kids these principles, because when those are not taught at a young age, and we're destroying parts of our history. Sometimes you look around and some people want to cover up our history and our past, and we're not a perfect nation. We've made mistakes, but I'm one that I think that we need to never forget our past and our history, because that's what will prevent us from making some of the same mistakes in the future. So I think educating our kids about these principles and these concepts is so important, because when you don't understand that, then it's easy to be swayed by the public opinion of the day, no matter what that may be. And instead of sticking to a principle, it's easy to be swayed, and then that's how we start to get lost. We start losing our way of who we are as a nation. On the national platform, I'm shocked at how more and more people want the government. They view the government as being the solution to the problem. And if we just had more government, or more money to do this or to do that, and get rid of all those bad, greedy business people, and I guess I'll just say it right out: promotion of socialism in this country. I'm shocked that is such a growing movement today. But I think it is there because of the lack of knowledge and the lack of education on some of these basic underlying principles.
It's fascinating to me. Some of the newest members of the Liberty Movement, regardless of which political party they belong to, are very often first-generation children of Eastern European refugees, and their parents are still very much alive. They may have been refugees from particularly terrible places like Romania, or even say Czechoslovakia, nations like that, which had suffered so mightily under the yoke of Russian power, and they, through their parents, are outraged when they see these naive pans to socialism and central government power. It's the problem is, though, that if you look, for example, at the recent negotiations over the most recent bailout, the absence of any moral hazard, if you will, has created an environment where if we're giving billions of dollars to companies after just a few short weeks of deprivation, which, as terrible as it is, my father's 97. He's a veteran of World War II. 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and survived 5 years in the infantry. Did the tour from North Africa to Switzerland and back and forth once or twice. And he looks at what we consider deprivation and privation as sort of walks in the park, And so if I fear that with these big checks we're writing, you've literally got the Bernie Sanders folks saying, well, if we can write a $2 trillion check for this, that $3 trillion check we were talking about for Medicaid for all should be a walk in the park. Someone has to draw the line somewhere, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And it just seems like it's so easy. Well, just take the money, and that's the money is going to solve the problem. But people need to really understand what they're giving up when they take that money, when they receive that money, that they're giving up their liberties and their freedoms, because there's always some string that's attached there.
Right.
And yes, what we're seeing, the part that really bothers me now is this effort to now bail out all these states that have acted
Right.
irresponsibly. Why should
We're
my
one of them.
kids and my grandkids, well, uh, New York and California, I mean,
And Rhode
they've
Island.
been spending money like to no avail. Their pension fund is broken. And why should our kids and our grandkids have to, pay the price to bail them out for their fiscal irresponsibility? Here in Idaho, we have a balanced budget requirement, and we've been prudent. The legislature has kept the spending in check, and not always. That was actually one of the reasons why I ran for state representative back in the early 2000s, because our state budget was growing at a rate of 13-14%, which is way too high, higher than the economy is growing. But on the state level, you actually we should not just sit back and complain about these things. If it really truly bothers us, then we get involved and we help change it. And so my 10 years of service in the legislature was all about that. It was all about fiscal responsibility and keeping the growth of government in check, in line with the growth of the economy. I can remember my first bill that I took to the legislature was to put a cap on spending of the legislature, that they couldn't the spending of the budget couldn't go higher than the rate of the growth in the population plus the rate of inflation. And as you can imagine, that wasn't a very popular bill for a freshman legislator to be bringing her first year, to tell them that they couldn't spend so much money. But I guess my point is that on a state level, we can make a difference. We can get involved, make a difference, and help to make sure that our states are run efficiently and effectively and responsively to our citizens. But then these other states that don't do that, and why should we in Idaho bail those states out? That's the part of this discussion about this COVID bailout that really bothers me right now. Fortunately, the Senate is refusing to consider that, and I hope that they stay strong with that, because that is just such a dereliction of duty there.
I'm not often
So
on the
wrong.
same side as Mr. McConnell, but his points just a handful of weeks ago about pension funds, and as you bring them out, is so apt. I am living in one of those states. Rhode Island is a state of barely 1 million people with a nearly, are you ready for this, $10 billion budget for a state that's approximately about 44 miles tall. And they are facing, because of this, nearly a $900 million structural shortfall because of COVID. And at the same time, they have yet to furlough or cut the hours of a single state employee, while simultaneously closing. Rhode Island is a state of small businesses, and they've closed Main Street. And again, it's just getting back to our original subject. There's this terrible disconnect at so many levels, where, and that's why I've enjoyed this conversation. I've looked back at some of your other articles that you've written. First of all, the very notion that you're routinely writing op-ed pieces speaks to a desire to communicate directly with people, without the filters, without the PR spokesman, without all the nonsense. You've established a direct line to your constituents. And that is so often missing in American government, because you do need to explain to people why you support or oppose a certain bill, and I find that very unique as well. It's almost house on to a bygone era, but it's you get back to any of these issues. You've got state governments being hijacked to federal mandates. Very often, I'll call them either unfunded or underfunded mandates. And again, they're taking your state's money, in this case in the form of the cost that you incur with the National Guard, the human cost that you incur with the National Guard, and they're dangling that over you. If for very simply, you have to often do the dance just to survive fiscally. And again, if you look at how they absolutely squandered both not only financially the costs involved in maintaining a National Guard, but the incredible loss of life or the loss of quality of life for so many families, the generational cost of this will be accounted for at some point, and it will be staggering. I fear we have lost an entire generation to a war machine without purpose. Am I overstating it?
I agree. I absolutely agree, and that's the biggest tragedy of this whole thing is the lack of regard for the individual and the human effect on our men and women that have gone out and served. It's very unnecessary. They try to hold the funding thing over our head and say, well, if you do this, maybe the funding of the federal dollars for the Guard might go away. But I would challenge that, that notion. I don't believe that they would actually do that. And maybe it hasn't been tested. It just needs to be tested.
Well, I mean, it's not like you are asking the state of Idaho, you and Mr. McKnight, and I'll talk about him in a second, but you and your views are not, if you will, asking the state of Idaho to abdicate from their responsibilities. You, in fact, are asking for nothing more than a reinforcement of the constitutional relationship between local militias as they were recognized in the initial chapters in the very beginnings of our Constitution, really at the root of our Constitution. Yeah. All you're looking to do is get them recognized. That's
get back
not
to
right.
That's right. Get back to the principle of what this country was, the underlying principles of what makes this country work. Getting back to that.
Yeah, that shouldn't be even considered an ask, and never mind a big ask. Now, Idaho is very fortunate. You in a sense, are one of the spiritual homes of this movement. I've had an opportunity to chat now with Mr. McKnight a few times, and he's going to be on the show within the next week or so. We're certainly going to do our best to gin up Rhode Island's support of this. It'll be interesting because, again, I'll go to a state government that's the epitome of Soviet era. All we're missing here are the dollar stores. We got the apparatchiks. All we're missing are the dollar stores. That's coming soon. But we're going to ask them to do both from an anti-war perspective as well as a constitutional perspective, recognize exactly what you're trying to accomplish. And to me, the mixing of those two, I think, will be a real litmus test for how serious folks are about this. I'll call it the spirituality of their politics. If they truly believe in being opposed to war, then this is a winner. If they truly believe in limited government, then this is even a clearer winner.
And that's absolutely. And that's part of Dan McKnight he's done a great job of advocating for the cause, and a lot of the benefit of drafting these bills and passing them through the legislative session is for the educational aspect of it. So, so that because they've been effective in sending the wrong message that these bills are anti veteran, that we're opposed to, we don't support our veterans and our service members if we're promoting this. And it's not about that at all, but by drafting a bill and putting it through the committee process, where it's a great opportunity to help educate the policymakers and introduce them to these veterans and listen to their real life experience there. Dan McKnight's done a great job doing that, not just in Idaho, but across the country. In a matter of months, they grew their organization to several thousand, from just a handful of people to, I think, over 20,000 members. And he's been making some good progress. I wanted to mention with our Senator Risch, just April 10th, Senator Risch actually signed a pledge, and I pulled this up on the website of the Bring Our Troops Home on April. So when I went to Washington, D.C. in November of last year, and we had this great conference to promote the effort, and there were legislators from around the country there, and we went to visit. Part of our job was to go visit with each one of our congressional delegates over there, and at the time we met with Senator Risch, and he was gracious. He welcomed us into his office, and he listened to what we had to say. But at the time, he wasn't willing to commit to anything. But as of April 10th, he signed a pledge. He's the chairman of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he signed a pledge sponsored by the National Veterans Group, Bring Our Troops Home, promising that in the future he will insist that Congress exercise the constitutional authority granted solely to the legislative branch to declare war. So that's huge progress there,
Right.
that Dan made with our own Senator Risch in 4 or 5 months time, and so he's doing a great job. He's a good guy, and I'm sure he'll be welcomed onto your show next week.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to this. Again, we're going to try and the Northeast is challenging politically. I'll just leave it at that. But again, this issue really transcends politics. It's really a question of morality. So I would hope that even if folks who are initially worried about some of the fiscal implications of it, which to your point, I believe are not going to happen. If folks are worried about the foreign policy implications of it, well, then they really need to have a constitutional intervention. If in fact they're worried now all of a sudden because of drawbacks in military spending, if you will, on troops, certainly not on assets, but on troops, if they're worried about that and they're unable to maintain this, worldwide reach where American military are reaching out and touching everyone, then I think they need to have either a new career or maybe a sit down with some of the veterans like Mr. McKnight and people like that who have served in the National Guard and clearly are not fulfilling their mission to their home communities. They're being used as tools. And
Yes.
so this is one of those issues that there's a moral imperative behind that really needs to be led with. And the other stuff, well, we can work it out somehow. I'm just sure. I got a feeling that there's room for change at other levels. Listen. I want to thank you so much for joining us. Very, very grateful. I know. I can only imagine. I should say. I don't know. I can only imagine the type of time pressures you're under. The fact that you're willing to multitask and not let, as is happening in so many state houses around the nation, the exigency of the COVID-19 crisis be used politically to crowd out other things from your schedule, which are important, pressing, but in a different way than the day-to-day crisis issues you're facing running a state. And so I applaud that as well, because we do not have to put our civil liberties, the future of our young men and women, on a back burner while we address some of the issues that we're being faced with during this terrible plague.
We can't be sidetracked. We cannot be sidetracked by this, and we have to. The critical importance that we can never sacrifice is the protection of this great nation. And I think the unfortunately the dilution by having our troops quartered all over the world, it's a drain on the resource, and it's taken us away from what the focus really needs to be, and that is to protect our own borders. We need to have a very strong defense system built around our country, because a country like China, they could take out, one thing that I'm really concerned about with this coronavirus, we're seeing more and more people working from home and in demand for more internet capacity. The Heritage Foundation put out a video about a decade or so ago, and it was all about the concept of our enemies taking out, when so much of our economy is built on this wireless, this cyber security, they can, by their missiles, they can take that out, and it would be so devastating to our country. And so we cannot be sidetracked in our effort, whether fighting this virus or spreading our resources thin across the world. We cannot be sidetracked from the most important thing that our central government should be providing for us as citizens, and that is the protection of our people and the protection of our boundaries, our borders.
Outstanding. Well, Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin, she of the great state of Idaho. I certainly hope if in fact your journeys bring you up to the Northeast, that you'll reach out to us and let us know ahead of time, because we'd love to have a few folks sit with you and maybe have lunch or show you what Italian cooking is like here in Rhode Island.
Oh,
which
that
is
sounds awesome. That sounds good.
Yeah,
We'll
it's an amazing university / restaurant culture here in Rhode Island. These folks are working hard to survive all of this, some of the same issues you're facing at home. And, you know, we, if nothing else, I don't know if you're an oysters fan, but we have the finest oysters on the planet. Yep. It's we are the ocean state, and we'd love to extend our hospitality to you.
Well, thank you. That's so kind. And I appreciate that invitation, and I would look forward to that. So maybe someday we'll get to meet personally.
All right.
So we'll keep in touch.
And I hope you'll stay in touch on policy issues as well, because this is something we're going to revisit.
Great.
And I also enjoy your economic perspective on what's happening in other parts of the country. I think I'll leave you with this thought: the very often states like ours, Idaho, Rhode Island, I'll call them the smaller states, the less populous states, not the powerhouse central states. We operate somewhat in silos. And for folks who are particularly on the liberty side of the aisle, I think we need to exchange notes. I think we need to exchange experiences and provide mutual support for issues like we discussed tonight. And in doing so, we'll find strength to oppose some of these vastly larger, vastly more well-financed interest groups. And I think there's power and strength to be had there. So, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Agree. Thank you, Pat. It's great to end. Please call me if you want to have another discussion on another issue. I'm happy to have another conversation with you. Thank you.
Well, Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin, she, of course, of the great state of Idaho, weighing in here at the Coalition. We are the Coalition. As always, we are loud and proud and outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com. If you're listening to this for the first time, if you have a moment, if you could, we are at Facebook at facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. We are at Twitter at Coalition_radio. And, of course, our mothership at coalitionradionetwork.com. By the way, this show simulcasts on our website, on the Facebook, on Periscope, as also LinkedIn, Twitter, Twitch, and a few other places. So there'll be great opportunities. We will be replaying this often in the coming weeks as we amplify the cause. Have a wonderful night, and thank you for joining us.